An elderly father, 68 years old, goes camping with his adult son in an attempt to reconnect after years of a distant relationship. What was meant to be a moment of reconciliation turns into betrayal when the son steals his backpack and abandons him in the forest, laughing as he walks away. Lost and vulnerable, the father must confront not only the dangers of nature, but also decades of failures as a parent. During his struggle for survival, he finds unexpected help from strangers who become his true family, discovering that sometimes we need to lose ourselves completely in order to finally find who we are. The laughter still echoes in my ears 3 months later, cold and sharp as the October wind that cut through the Oregon pines that morning. I'm Harold Mitchell, 68 years old, and I never thought I'd live to hear my own son laugh at my desperation, but I'm getting ahead of myself. Let me tell you how I ended up alone in the Cascade Wilderness, abandoned by the person I'd spent a lifetime trying to love. It started with a phone call 2 weeks earlier. Danny's voice on the other end was different somehow, softer than it had been in years. "Dad," he said, and I could almost hear him forcing the word out. "I've been thinking, maybe we should try that camping trip you always talked about when I was a kid." My heart stopped. Danny was 34, married, with twin daughters I barely knew. We hadn't spoken properly in over a year, not since that argument about money, again. The same argument we'd been having since he turned 18. I was always too controlling with finances, he said. Never trusted him with anything. Maybe he was right, but when you've worked your whole life to build something, watching your son blow through opportunities like autumn leaves gets to you. "Really?" I managed to say, gripping the phone tighter. "When were you thinking?" "Next weekend. Just us, like we should have done years ago." I should have heard the calculation in his voice. Should have recognized the tone I'd heard 100 times before when he needed something. But I was hungry for connection, starving for the relationship I'd always imagined we'd have. So I said yes, without hesitation. The drive to the Willamette National Forest took 3 hours. Danny picked me up in his pickup truck, a vehicle I'd helped him buy 2 years ago during one of his fresh starts. He seemed genuinely excited, talking about trails he'd researched, the perfect spot he'd found near Silver Creek. For the first time in years, I allowed myself to hope. "Remember when you used to tell me stories about camping with Grandpa Joe?" Danny asked, as we wound through the mountain roads, his hands steady on the steering wheel. "Every weekend when you were little," I replied, watching the familiar landscape roll by. "You always begged me to take you to the same places." "Yeah, well, you were always too busy working." There was an edge to his voice that made my stomach tighten, but he quickly covered it with a smile. "But we're doing it now, right?" The campsite was beautiful, I'll give him that. A small clearing beside the creek, surrounded by towering Douglas firs and the kind of silence that makes city folks uncomfortable. We set up our tents side by side, and for a moment, watching Danny work with the tent stakes, I could see the boy he used to be. The one who built blanket forts in the living room and insisted on helping me fix things around the house, even when his help made everything take twice as long. That first night around the campfire, we talked about safe things. His job at the lumber yard, my retirement from the accounting firm, the weather. But underneath every word was the weight of everything we'd never said to each other. I kept wanting to ask about the girls, about Sarah, about whether he was happy. But Danny had always been like a skittish animal when it came to personal questions, approached too directly, and he'd bolt. "You know, Dad," he said, poking at the fire with a stick, sparks dancing up into the darkness. "I've been thinking a lot about Mom lately." My throat tightened. Linda had been gone for 4 years now, cancer taking her piece by piece while Danny and I stood helplessly by, united in our grief, but somehow still unable to reach each other. "She always said we were too much alike," I said quietly. "Stubborn as mules," she used to say. Danny laughed, but it wasn't the laugh I would come to fear. This one was warm, sad around the edges. She was right. Remember how she used to make us apologize to each other after we'd fight? And we'd both stand there, arms crossed, waiting for the other one to go first. Every single time. He looked at me across the flames, and for a moment, I thought I saw something like affection in his eyes. Maybe we should have listened to her better. I went to sleep that night feeling something I hadn't felt in years. Hope. Real hope that maybe, finally, we could build something together. That maybe it wasn't too late for us. The next morning dawned clear and cold. I woke early, as I always do, and found Danny already up, fiddling with his backpack near the dying embers of our fire. "Morning, son," I called, emerging from my tent and stretching muscles that reminded me of every one of my 68 years. "Morning, Dad." He didn't look at me, focused intently on whatever he was doing with his pack. "I thought we could hike up to Eagle's Peak today. Great views from up there. Sounds perfect. I moved to pack my own gear. Medications going carefully into the side pocket, extra water, the emergency supplies I always brought camping. Linda used to tease me about being overprepared, but growing up with a father who'd survived the depression teaches you to expect the unexpected. Actually, Dad, Danny said, straightening up, why don't you let me carry that for you? The trail's pretty steep and I don't want you overexerting yourself. Something cold flickered in my chest, but I pushed it down. He was being thoughtful, caring even. I can manage my own pack, son. I may be getting older, but I'm not helpless yet. I know, but humor me, okay? Let me take care of you for once. The way he said it, so earnest, so much like the boy who used to insist on carrying groceries that were too heavy for him, made me relent. I handed over my backpack, watching as he secured it to his own somehow. Just for the steep parts, I said. Just for the steep parts, he agreed. We hiked for about 2 hours, the trail winding steadily upward through old-growth forest. Danny set a good pace, not too fast, stopping periodically to point out birds or interesting rock formations. We talked more easily than we had in years, sharing stories, laughing at old memories. I found myself thinking that maybe this was it. Maybe this was how we finally healed the rift between us. Then we reached a fork in the trail. Eagle's Peak is that way, I said, pointing to the left where the official trail markers clearly indicated. Danny looked right, toward a narrower, less maintained path that disappeared into thick underbrush. Actually, I found this great spot yesterday when I was scouting. Trust me, the view is incredible. Yesterday, I thought we were exploring this together. I just wanted to make sure I could find the good spots, you know? Make this special for us. Again, that reasonable tone, that caring son voice. I followed him down the right fork, my hiking boots finding purchase on the increasingly rough terrain. The path grew fainter, more overgrown. Branches caught at my clothes and I had to duck under fallen logs. Danny, are you sure this is right? This doesn't look like a maintained trail. Trust me, Dad. Just a little further. After another 30 minutes of hiking, we emerged into a small clearing. It was beautiful, I'll admit, a circle of grass surrounded by towering pines, with filtered sunlight creating patterns on the forest floor. But there was no view, no peak, no destination that would justify the difficult hike to get here. This is nice, son, but where's this incredible view you mentioned? Danny was standing about 10 feet away from me, my backpack still secured to his own gear. He was looking at me with an expression I couldn't quite read, something between pity and contempt. Dad, he said quietly, there is no view. What do you mean? I mean, we're not going to Eagle's Peak. We're not going anywhere together. He started backing away from me toward the trail we'd come from. I need that money, Dad. The money Mom left you. The money you keep holding over my head. The world seemed to tilt sideways. Danny, what are you talking about? Sarah's leaving me. The twins. They need things I can't provide. I've got debts you don't know about, Dad. Real debts. To real people who don't care about payment plans or second chances. Son, we can work this out. Whatever you need, we can... No. His voice was sharp now. All pretense dropped. We can't work it out. You'll just lecture me again about responsibility and making better choices and how disappointed you are. Same song, different day. He was backing steadily away, my pack bouncing against his back with each step. In that pack were my medications, my water, my emergency supplies, my phone, my wallet, everything I needed to survive out here. Danny, please, don't do this. I'm sorry, Dad, I really am, but you'll be fine. Someone will find you. You've got that survival training from your Boy Scout days, right? He was almost at the tree line now, his voice carrying across the clearing. The car keys are in the truck. When you make it back to the parking lot, just drive yourself home. Son, I can't make it back without... That's when I heard it. The laughter. Cold, bitter laughter that cut through the morning air like a blade. My own son, my own blood laughing at my panic, at my predicament, at the trap he'd so carefully laid. Don't worry, Dad, he called over his shoulder as he disappeared into the forest. I'll make sure the money goes to good use. And then he was gone, leaving me alone in a wilderness I didn't know, without supplies, without help, without hope. The silence that settled over the clearing was deafening, broken only by the sound of my own ragged breathing and the distant call of a crow. I stood there for I don't know how long, staring at the spot where my son had vanished, trying to process what had just happened. This wasn't a misunderstanding or a moment of poor judgment. This was calculated, planned. He had never intended for us to go camping together. He had never wanted to repair our relationship. I had been nothing more than a means to an end, and now that end had been achieved. The October sun filtered through the canopy above, casting everything in golden light that should have been beautiful, but now felt mockingly cheerful. I was 68 years old, alone in the Oregon wilderness, abandoned by the person I'd spent my entire adult life trying to reach. And somewhere in the distance, carried on the wind, I could swear I still heard the echo of his laughter. Word count. Manvel 847 words. Tentar novamente. Te faça. O bloco 2, com 1800 palavras no idioma inglês. Editar. Chapter 2. The first night, the sun was already beginning its descent when the reality of my situation finally hit me. I'd been standing in that clearing for over an hour, staring at the spot where Danny had disappeared, as if willing him to come back would somehow make it happen. As if this was all some elaborate joke that had gone too far. But the forest doesn't care about your denial. The temperature was dropping, and I could feel the October chill seeping through my flannel shirt. Without my pack, I had nothing. No shelter, no food, no water beyond what I could find in the creek we'd crossed earlier, and most critically, no medications. The heart pills I'd been taking since my bypass surgery 3 years ago were somewhere in the wilderness with my son, along with everything else I needed to survive. I forced myself to move, to think. 40 years of watching survival shows and reading outdoor magazines had to count for something. First priority, water. Second, shelter. Third, figure out how the hell to get back to civilization. The creek was about a quarter-mile back the way we'd come, down the overgrown trail that had brought us to this clearing. I made my way carefully, my 68-year-old knees protesting every uneven step, every fallen log I had to climb over. The trail was even harder to follow going back. Branches seemed to grab at me from every direction, and more than once I lost the path entirely, having to backtrack and search for the faint signs of our earlier passage. When I finally reached the water, I knelt beside it and drank deeply, cupping the cold mountain water in my hands. It tasted clean, but I knew that meant nothing. Giardia, cryptosporidium, all the nasties that could turn your stomach inside out, were invisible to the naked eye, but I was already playing a losing game. Without water, I'd be dead in 3 days. With contaminated water, at least I'd have a fighting chance. The sun was lower now, painting the forest in shades of gold and amber that would have been breathtaking under different circumstances. I had maybe 2 hours of daylight left, and the temperature was dropping fast. I needed shelter, and I needed it soon. I'd watched enough survival programs to know the basics. Find or build something to get off the ground, insulate yourself from wind, trap your body heat. Easier said than done when you're working with nothing but your hands and whatever the forest provides. About 50 yards upstream from where I'd been drinking, I found a fallen Douglas fir that had come down in some long-ago storm. It was massive, probably 3 feet in diameter, and it had fallen across 2 large boulders, creating a natural lean-to frame. It would have to do. Gathering materials was back-breaking work. Every branch I broke, every armload of pine needles I collected, reminded me of how out of shape I'd become since retirement. My back ached, my hands were scratched and bleeding from the rough bark, and I was sweating despite the cold air. But I kept working because the alternative was freezing to death. I layered pine boughs against the log, trying to create a windbreak. Then I gathered every pine needle, dead leaf, and piece of soft debris I could find, piling it into what I hoped would be an insulating bed. It wasn't much, certainly nothing like the warm sleeping bag that was currently traveling away from me in my stolen backpack, but it might keep me alive through the night. As darkness fell, the forest came alive with sounds I'd never noticed during our daylight hikes. Owls calling to each other across the canopy, the rustle of small animals in the underbrush, the creak and groan of trees settling in the cooling air. Every noise made my heart race. Every snap of a twig could be a bear, a cougar, or something worse. I crawled into my makeshift shelter, pulling pine boughs over myself like a blanket. The needles poked through my clothes, and the ground was hard and cold despite my efforts at insulation, but I was out of the wind. That had to count for something. Lying there in the darkness, staring up at the stars visible through the canopy, I couldn't stop my mind from racing. How had I been so blind? How had I missed the signs that this was all a setup? But even as I asked myself these questions, I knew the answer. I'd seen what I wanted to see, heard what I desperately wanted to hear. Danny had always been charming when he needed something. Even as a child, he could talk his way out of trouble, convince you that black was white if it served his purposes. Linda used to worry about it, said he was too smooth for his own good. He needs to learn that actions have consequences, she'd tell me. You can't keep bailing him out every time he makes a mistake. But I did keep bailing him out. Every failed business venture, every unpaid loan, every crisis that somehow required my intervention, I told myself it was love, but maybe it was guilt. Guilt over all the little league games I'd missed, all the school plays I'd been too busy to attend, all the bedtime stories that got cut short because I had work to finish. The worst part wasn't even the betrayal, it was the laughter. That cold, bitter sound that told me everything I needed to know about how my son really saw me. Not as a father, not as someone who'd sacrificed for him, but as an obstacle, a problem to be solved, a means to an end. Somewhere around midnight, I heard something moving near my shelter. Heavy footsteps, deliberate and close. I held my breath, trying to make myself as small as possible under my covering of branches. The footsteps circled my shelter once, twice, then stopped directly in front of the opening. I could hear breathing, deep, steady breathing, that definitely didn't belong to any small woodland creature. My heart was hammering so hard, I was sure whatever was out there could hear it. I thought about Linda's rosary tucked away in the jewelry box at home. I wasn't a particularly religious man, but in that moment I found myself praying to whatever might be listening. The breathing continued for what felt like hours, but was probably only minutes. Then, as suddenly as it had arrived, it was gone. The footsteps moved away, fading into the distance until all I could hear was the normal symphony of forest sounds. I didn't sleep after that. Every time I started to drift off, I'd hear another sound, real or imagined, that would jolt me awake. The cold seeped through my improvised bedding, making my joints ache and my muscles cramp. By dawn, I was shivering uncontrollably, exhausted, and more frightened than I'd ever been in my life. But I was alive. Against all odds, I'd survived my first night in the wilderness. As the sky began to lighten and the first birds started their morning songs, I allowed myself a moment of grim satisfaction. Danny might have left me to die, but I wasn't dead yet. If you've ever spent a night alone in the wilderness, you know that feeling. That mixture of terror and pride that comes with discovering you're tougher than you thought you were. If this story is reaching you wherever you are in the world, I'd love to know, where are you listening to this from? What corner of the globe is hearing about my darkest hours? But survival wasn't just about making it through one night. I needed a plan. I needed to find my way back to civilization, or at least to somewhere with cell phone coverage. The problem was, I had no idea which direction led back to the parking lot. Danny had led us on such a winding route, and I'd been so focused on our conversation that I hadn't paid attention to landmarks or direction. I climbed out of my shelter, my muscles screaming in protest, and looked around the small clearing where I'd spent the night. The creek ran roughly east-west, based on the position of the rising sun. Our campsite had been beside the creek, and we'd hiked generally uphill to reach this area. That meant downhill, and following the water might lead me back toward the main trail system. It was a plan, at least. Not a good plan, but better than sitting here waiting to die. I gathered what I could. Some pine nuts I found scattered under a large tree, a few late-season blackberries that the birds hadn't claimed, enough water to fill my cupped hands. It wasn't much, but it was something. Then I started walking downstream, following the creek as it wound through the forest. The going was rough. There was no trail here, just game paths that appeared and disappeared at random. I had to scramble over fallen trees, push through thick undergrowth, and navigate around boulders the size of small cars. Every step was a reminder of how unprepared I was for this, how completely out of my element. But I kept walking, because the alternative was giving up, and I wasn't ready to do that yet. Linda hadn't raised a quitter, and despite everything that had happened, I wasn't about to let my son's betrayal be the thing that killed me. The sun was fully up now, filtering through the canopy in shafts of golden light. It was going to be a beautiful day, the kind of October morning that makes you grateful to be alive. Under different circumstances, I might have stopped to appreciate it. So instead, I pressed on, following the creek downstream and hoping against hope that it would lead me home. Word count, 1,631 words, tentar novamente, ti faza, o bloco 3, com 1,800 palavras, no idioma, Inglés, editar, chapter 3, broken bones and broken pride. The second day started with promise. I'd been following the creek for about 2 hours when I heard something that made my heart leap. The distant sound of a diesel engine, a logging truck maybe, or maintenance crews working on the forest roads. Sound carries strangely in the mountains, bouncing off canyon walls and filtering through trees, but it was definitely mechanical, definitely human. I scrambled up the steep bank beside the creek, grabbing at roots and rocks to pull myself toward higher ground. If I could get elevation, maybe I could see where the sound was coming from. Maybe I could flag down whoever was out there. That's when everything went wrong. The rock I was using as a handhold came loose. One moment I was climbing confidently upward. The next I was falling backward, my body turning in the air as gravity claimed me. I hit the creek bank hard, my right leg folding under me at an angle that legs aren't supposed to bend. The sound it made, a wet crack like a tree branch breaking, is something I'll never forget. The pain was immediate and overwhelming. White-hot agony that shot from my ankle all the way up to my hip, making my vision blur and my stomach lurch. I tried to move, tried to adjust my position, and the pain doubled, forcing a scream from my throat that echoed off the canyon walls. My ankle was broken. Not just sprained or twisted, but genuinely, seriously broken. I could see the unnatural angle of my foot, could feel the grinding sensation of bone fragments shifting when I tried to move. In the wilderness, alone, without medical supplies or any means of communication, a broken ankle might as well be a death sentence. I lay there beside the creek for I don't know how long, waves of pain washing over me, trying to process this new disaster. The diesel engine sound had faded to nothing, probably a truck on some distant logging road miles away. Even if I'd been able to climb high enough to see it, there was no way they would have seen me. Eventually, the immediate shock wore off enough for me to think somewhat clearly. I needed to stabilize the ankle somehow, needed to find a way to move without making the injury worse. Using my belt and 2 straight branches I found nearby, I fashioned a crude splint. It wasn't much, but it kept the broken bones from moving around as much. Moving was agony. Every small adjustment sent lightning bolts of pain up my leg. Crawling was out of the question. The terrain was too rough, and putting any weight on the injured limb was impossible. I had to find another way. That's when I remembered something from my old Boy Scout days, back when I was 12 years old, and the world seemed full of adventures waiting to be had. We'd learned about travois, the drag litters that Native Americans used to transport injured people. If I could build something similar, maybe I could drag myself along the creek bed. It took me most of the afternoon, working through waves of pain and nausea. I lashed branches together with strips torn from my shirt, creating a crude frame that I could lie on and hopefully drag behind me as I moved. It wasn't elegant, and it sure wasn't comfortable, but it might keep me mobile. Testing it was terrifying. Every bump, every rock, every small dip in the ground sent shockwaves through my broken ankle. But it worked, sort of. I could pull myself along using my arms and my good leg, covering maybe 50 yards at a time before I had to rest. By evening, I'd managed to travel perhaps half a mile downstream. In normal circumstances, it would have been a 5-minute walk. In my current condition, it had taken most of the day and left me completely exhausted. I found another fallen tree to shelter under, but building any kind of adequate shelter was beyond my capabilities now. I gathered what pine needles I could reach without moving too much, but it was a pathetic effort compared to the previous night. The temperature was dropping again, and I was already shivering before the sun set. That night was the longest of my life. The pain in my ankle was constant, a throbbing agony that made sleep impossible. Every time I shifted position, even slightly, it would flare up like someone was driving a red-hot poker through my bone. I found myself thinking about the bottle of prescription painkillers sitting in my stolen backpack, probably miles away by now. But worse than the physical pain was the mental anguish. Lying there in the darkness, unable to move, I had nothing to do but think about how I'd ended up here, about all the ways I'd failed as a father, all the mistakes I'd made that had led to this moment. I thought about Danny as a little boy, maybe 7 or 8 years old, coming into my home office while I was working on tax returns. It was always tax season when he wanted attention, February, March, April, when I was putting in 14-hour days and living on coffee and stress. "Daddy," he'd said, tugging at my sleeve, "can you help me with my model airplane?" "Not now, son. Daddy's working. Maybe tomorrow." But tomorrow was always another crisis, another client emergency, another reason to put off spending time with my boy. I told myself I was providing for him, building a future, being responsible, but what I was really doing was choosing work over family over and over again, until the distance between us became so vast that neither of us knew how to bridge it. Linda tried to tell me. God, how many times had she tried to tell me? "He needs his father, Harold. The money can wait, the clients can wait, but childhood doesn't wait." I thought I had time. I thought there would always be opportunities to connect later, when things calmed down, when the business was more stable, when I wasn't so damn busy all the time. But later never came, did it? Later became never, And now here I was, abandoned in the wilderness by a son who saw me as nothing more than a bank account with legs. Somewhere around 3 in the morning, I heard them again. Footsteps in the darkness. But this time, there were more of them, and they were moving faster with purpose. I held my breath, trying to become invisible under my meager covering of branches. The footsteps stopped nearby, and I heard something that made my blood freeze. Voices. Low, urgent voices, speaking in a language I couldn't identify. Were they looking for me? Had Danny told someone where he'd left me? Were these people who might help, or were they something worse? I couldn't make out the words, but the tone was businesslike, professional. After a few minutes, the voices moved away, fading into the forest. But the encounter left me more shaken than the previous night's wildlife visitor. Who were those people, and what were they doing out here in the middle of nowhere at 3 in the morning? I didn't get any sleep after that. I lay there shivering, my broken ankle throbbing, listening to every sound the forest made and wondering if each one might herald another visitor. By dawn, I was delirious with pain and exhaustion, barely able to think clearly enough to continue my pitiful progress downstream. The third day was harder than the second. My improvised travois was falling apart, and I was too weak to repair it properly. I managed maybe a quarter mile before I had to stop, completely spent. My water supply was running low despite drinking from the creek, and I hadn't eaten anything substantial in over 48 hours. The few berries and pine nuts I'd managed to forage weren't enough to sustain a man my age under these conditions. That's when I saw the smoke. It was just a thin column rising above the trees, maybe a mile downstream from my position. A campfire, maybe, or someone burning brush, but it meant people, real people who might be able to help me. I tried to move faster, ignoring the screaming pain in my ankle, dragging myself along the creek bed with desperate determination. But a mile might as well have been 100 miles in my condition. By afternoon, I'd covered maybe another few hundred yards, and the smoke was no closer than it had been that morning. The sun was setting again, painting the forest in those same golden hues that had seemed so beautiful just 2 days ago. Now they looked ominous, a countdown to another night of cold and pain and fear. I was starting to realize that I might not make it out of here, that Danny's betrayal might actually kill me slowly and painfully, far from anyone who cared about me. But I wasn't dead yet, and as long as I was breathing, I was going to keep fighting. I thought about all the people who might be reading this story, people from different countries, different cultures, different walks of life. If you've ever faced a moment when everything seemed hopeless, when the odds were stacked against you and giving up seemed like the only option, you'll understand what I'm talking about. Tell me in the comments, where are you watching this from? What part of the world is hearing about my struggle right now? Because somehow, knowing that my story would eventually be told, that people would hear about these dark hours and maybe find some strength in them, that thought kept me going when everything else failed. I pulled my makeshift shelter around me one more time, gritted my teeth against the pain, and prepared to face another long night in the wilderness. Word count, 1,562 words. Tentar novamente. T fasa o bloco for 1800 palavras. No idioma Inglés editor. Chapter 4. The Angel in Flannel. The fourth morning brought something I hadn't felt since this nightmare began. Actual warmth. Not from the sun, which was still struggling to penetrate the thick canopy above, but from a wool blanket that definitely hadn't been there when I'd fallen asleep. I opened my eyes slowly, my mind foggy from pain and exhaustion, and tried to process what I was seeing. The blanket was real, thick, heavy wool that smelled faintly of wood smoke and coffee. Beside my makeshift shelter, someone had left a thermos, a small bag that looked like it might contain food, and a note weighted down with a smooth river rock. My hands shook as I unfolded the paper. The handwriting was careful, measured, like someone who didn't write in English very often. You are hurt bad. I bring help tomorrow. Stay here, drink water, eat food. You are not alone now. I stared at that note for a long time, reading it over and over until the words blurred together. Someone had found me. Someone had seen my pitiful condition, and instead of just walking away, had actually helped. After 3 days of abandonment and betrayal, this simple act of kindness hit me harder than I expected. I'm not ashamed to admit I cried, deep, racking sobs that shook my whole body and made my broken ankle throb even worse. The thermos contained hot coffee, still warm despite having been left sometime during the night. Real coffee, strong and black, the kind that kicks you in the teeth and makes you remember you're alive. I drank it slowly, savoring each sip, feeling the caffeine course through my system like liquid hope. The bag held treasures, 2 thick slices of homemade bread, a chunk of hard cheese, some kind of dried meat that tasted like heaven, and, miracle of miracles, a small bottle of aspirin. I took 3 pills immediately, knowing it would barely touch the pain but grateful for anything that might help. As I ate, I studied my surroundings more carefully. How had this mysterious helper found me? And more importantly, how had they approached without waking me? I'd been jolted awake by every small sound for the past 3 nights, but someone had managed to leave supplies right next to my shelter without disturbing my sleep. The answer came when I looked more closely at the ground around my shelter. There were footprints in the soft earth beside the creek, large boots with a distinctive tread pattern. But these prints approached from upstream, from the direction I'd been traveling, not from the forest around me. Whoever this M was, they'd been following the same creek, maybe even following me. This thought should have been alarming, but instead it was comforting. For the first time in days, I wasn't completely alone. Someone knew where I was, someone cared enough to help, someone was planning to bring more assistance. All I had to do was survive one more day. The coffee and food worked miracles on my energy levels. By mid-morning, I actually felt human again, still in tremendous pain, still trapped in the wilderness with a broken ankle, but no longer quite so close to despair. I used the extra energy to improve my shelter, gathering more pine boughs and arranging them into a more wind-proof configuration. If I was going to stay put and wait for help, I might as well be as comfortable as possible. Around noon, I heard voices again. This time they were closer, and I could make out that they were speaking English. Sort of. The words were heavily accented, and the conversation was punctuated by what sounded like another language entirely. I called out, my voice cracking from disuse and dehydration. "Hello, I'm here. I need help." The voices stopped immediately. Then I heard movement through the underbrush, branches snapping and leaves rustling as someone approached my position. A few moments later, a figure emerged from the forest. A man, probably in his 50s, wearing work clothes and carrying a rifle. He was short and stocky, with weathered skin and kind eyes that took in my condition immediately. His face was unmistakably Native American, and when he spoke, his accent confirmed what I'd suspected from the note. "You are the lost man," he said, approaching slowly with his hands visible. "I am Marcus. I leave the coffee this morning." "Marcus," I repeated, the name feeling like a prayer on my lips. "Thank you. God, thank you so much." He knelt beside my shelter, his experienced eyes taking in my improvised splint, the crude travois I'd been using, the general state of my condition. He clicked his tongue disapprovingly. "This ankle, it is very bad. How many days you are here?" "4 days," I said. "My son, he left me here, took all my gear and just left." Something dark flickered across Marcus's face, but he didn't comment on the family dynamics. Instead, he pulled a 2-way radio from his belt and spoke into it in rapid-fire words I couldn't understand. The response was immediate. Another male voice, also heavily accented, asking what sounded like questions. "My brother Joseph, he is bringing the truck," Marcus explained, after ending the radio conversation. "But the road, it is maybe 2 miles from here. We must make a better way to carry you." Over the next hour, Marcus worked with quiet efficiency to construct what he called a proper travois. Using materials from his pack, rope, canvas, metal stakes, he built something that looked like it might actually work for transporting an injured person over rough terrain. "You do this before?" I asked, watching him work. "Many times. Hunters get hurt, hikers get lost. Sometimes we find them in time." The way he said it implied that sometimes they didn't find them in time, but I didn't pursue that line of thinking. "We? You're part of a search and rescue team?" Marcus smiled for the first time since I'd met him. "Something like that. My family, we know these woods. When people go missing, police sometimes ask us to help look." As he worked, I found myself studying this man who'd appeared like an angel in my darkest hour. His movements were economical, practiced, like someone who'd spent his entire life in the outdoors. Every knot he tied was perfect, every measurement exact. This wasn't luck or coincidence. Marcus knew exactly what he was doing. "How did you find me?" I asked. "Joseph, he see a car at the trailhead. Same car sitting there 3 days, nobody comes back, so we start looking." He glanced up from his work, and there was something in his expression I couldn't quite read. "Your son, he drive away the first day. Leave the car. Take a different truck." My stomach dropped. "You saw him?" "Joseph saw him with another man. They take gear from the car, put it in the truck, drive away laughing." The betrayal hit me all over again, fresh and sharp as a blade. It was one thing to know that Danny had abandoned me. It was another entirely to learn that he'd brought help, that this had been planned with accomplices, that they'd been laughing about leaving me to die. "I'm sorry," Marcus said quietly, tying off a final knot. "Family should not do this thing." I couldn't speak for a moment. When I finally found my voice, it came out as barely more than a whisper. "Why are you helping me? You don't know me. I could be anyone." Marcus looked at me with those kind, weathered eyes, and when he spoke, his words carried the weight of absolute truth. "In the woods, we are all the same. Cold, hungry, afraid. When you find someone who is lost, you help them find their way home. This is not about who you are, this is about who we are." The radio crackled to life, Joseph's voice reporting that he was in position with the truck. Marcus helped me onto the travois he'd constructed, securing me with straps and padding the hard canvas with pine boughs. It was infinitely more comfortable than my crude contraption had been. "This will hurt," he warned as he began pulling me through the forest, "but not so much as staying here." He was right. Every bump, every route we crossed, every small dip in the terrain sent shockwaves through my broken ankle. But it was bearable pain now, pain with a purpose. We were moving toward help, toward safety, toward the possibility of real medical attention. The journey to the truck took almost 2 hours. Marcus pulled steadily, stopping frequently to check on me and adjust the travois when it caught on obstacles. He never complained, never seemed winded, never gave any indication that dragging a 68-year-old man through the wilderness was anything other than a normal part of his day. When we finally reached the logging road where Joseph was waiting, I got my first good look at my second rescuer. He was younger than Marcus, maybe 35, with the same weathered skin and kind eyes. The truck was an old Ford pickup, battered but clearly well maintained, with a lumber rack that they quickly reconfigured to hold the travois. "Hospital?" Joseph asked, and Marcus nodded. "Hospital first, then we call the police." As we drove toward civilization, bouncing along forest roads that seemed to go on forever, I found myself thinking about the past 4 days, about how quickly everything can change, how thin the line is between safety and disaster, about the randomness of human kindness, how 2 strangers had risked their own time and energy to save someone they'd never met. If you're listening to this story from somewhere around the world, I want you to understand something. There are still people like Marcus and Joseph out there, people who help not because they have to, but because it's the right thing to do. Where are you hearing this from? What country? What city? I hope there are people like my guardian angels wherever you are. We were heading toward help now, toward healing, toward the next chapter of this nightmare. But even as relief flooded through me, I knew the hardest part was still to come. I had to figure out what to do about my son. Chapter 5. The Reckoning. The hospital smelled like disinfectant and broken dreams. As they wheeled me into the emergency room, I caught a glimpse of myself in the reflection of the automatic doors, a wild-haired old man with haunted eyes, covered in dirt and pine needles, looking like something that had crawled out of a horror movie. The medical staff moved with practiced efficiency. X-rays confirmed what I already knew. My ankle was severely fractured in 3 places. Surgery would be required, pins and plates to hold the bones together, months of physical therapy ahead. But I was alive, and that was more than I'd dared hope for just 12 hours earlier. Detective Sarah Chen arrived while I was in recovery, a small Asian woman with intelligent eyes and a no-nonsense demeanor that reminded me of Linda. She pulled up a chair beside my hospital bed and opened a notebook that looked like it had seen years of hard use. "Mr. Mitchell, I'm going to need you to walk me through everything that happened starting from the beginning." So I told her. Everything. The phone call, the camping trip, the hike to nowhere, the moment Danny disappeared with my pack while his laughter echoed through the forest. I told her about the voices in the night, the mysterious footsteps, the 4 days of struggling to survive with a broken ankle and no supplies. Detective Chen took notes throughout my story, occasionally asking for clarification, but mostly just listening with the kind of focused attention that made me feel like every word mattered. When I finished, she was quiet for a long moment, tapping her pen against her notebook. "This is attempted murder, Mr. Mitchell. Abandoning someone in the wilderness without supplies, especially someone your age with medical conditions. Your son had to know this could kill you." The words hit me like a physical blow. Attempted murder. My own son had tried to murder me. "What happens now?" I asked. "Now we find him, and we make sure he faces the consequences of what he's done." Finding Danny wasn't difficult. He'd made no attempt to hide, apparently confident that I wouldn't survive to tell anyone what had happened. When the police arrived at his house 3 days later, he was in the middle of packing for what looked like an extended vacation. Tropical clothes, expensive luggage, airline tickets to Costa Rica. They found my stolen backpack in his garage, along with forged documents giving him power of attorney over my finances. The plan had been simple: abandon me in the wilderness, wait a reasonable amount of time for me to be declared dead, then claim my inheritance and disappear to a country with no extradition treaty. But the most damning evidence was on his phone, text messages with his accomplice, a man named Rick Hendricks, who owed money to some very dangerous people. They documented the entire plan, including their celebration at a bar after leaving me to die. "Can't believe the old bastard finally paid up," one message read. "Should have done this years ago." Another, sent while I was lying broken and freezing in the wilderness. "Think he's dead yet? LOL. Detective Chen showed me the messages during one of her visits, her expression carefully neutral, but I could see the disgust in her eyes, the barely controlled anger at what my son had done. "I've seen a lot of terrible things in this job, Mr. Mitchell," she said quietly, "but this is among the worst. Your own child." She didn't finish the sentence. She didn't need to. The trial took place 6 months later, after I'd healed enough to testify without crutches. The courtroom was packed. Apparently, the story of a son abandoning his father to die in the wilderness had captured the public's imagination. News crews clustered outside, reporters shoving microphones at anyone who would talk to them. Danny sat at the defendant's table in an expensive suit I'd probably paid for, flanked by 2 lawyers who looked like they cost more per hour than most people make in a week. He wouldn't look at me directly, but I could see him watching me out of the corner of his eye, calculating, always calculating. When it was my turn to testify, I took the stand and told my story one more time. About the betrayal, the abandonment, the 4 days of hell that followed. About lying in the wilderness with a broken ankle, listening to mysterious voices in the darkness, wondering if I would ever see another sunrise. The prosecutor was thorough, walking me through every detail, making sure the jury understood exactly what Danny had done and why. But it was the defense attorney's cross-examination that nearly broke me. "Isn't it true, Mr. Mitchell, that you were an absent father? That you prioritized work over family for most of your son's childhood?" "Yes, but... And isn't it true that you controlled your son financially well into his adult years, refusing to give him access to family money even when he desperately needed it?" "I was trying to teach him responsibility." "So you admit that you used money as a weapon against your own son?" I sat there on the witness stand, feeling the weight of decades of mistakes pressing down on me. Had I been a perfect father? No. Had I made terrible choices, prioritized the wrong things, failed my son in ways that mattered? Absolutely. But that didn't justify what he'd done to me. "I wasn't a perfect father," I said finally, my voice steady despite the tears running down my cheeks. "I made mistakes, many mistakes, but I never tried to kill him. I never abandoned him in the wilderness to die alone and afraid." The jury deliberated for less than 2 hours, guilty on all counts: attempted murder, elder abuse, theft, fraud, 25 years to life. Danny finally looked at me as they led him away in handcuffs. There was no remorse in his eyes, no acknowledgement of what he'd put me through, just cold calculation and, yes, that same bitter amusement I'd heard in his laughter that terrible morning in the forest. "You should have just died, old man," he said as he passed my seat in the gallery. "Would have been easier for everyone." Those were the last words my son ever spoke to me. 2 years have passed since Danny's conviction, and I'm sitting in Marcus's kitchen, watching him teach his 12-year-old grandson how to tie proper knots. The boy, Tommy, struggles with the rope, his small fingers fumbling with the complicated weaving pattern. But Marcus is patient in the way I never learned to be. "Like this, grandfather," Tommy says, holding up his attempt. Marcus examines the knot carefully, then gently shows him where it went wrong. "Close, but see here? This loop needs to go under, not over. Try again." No frustration, no impatience, no lecture about paying attention or trying harder, just quiet guidance and endless second chances. I never learned to be that kind of teacher. With Danny, I was always correcting, always pointing out flaws, always focused on the end result rather than the process of learning. Maybe that's where it all went wrong. The past 2 years haven't been easy. The physical recovery from my ankle injury was the simple part. Bones heal even at my age. The emotional recovery has been much harder. For months after the trial, I found myself replaying every moment of my relationship with Danny, looking for the exact point where love turned to resentment, where disappointment hardened into hatred. But I'm not the same man who walked into those woods with his son 2 years ago. That Harold Mitchell died out there in the wilderness, and what emerged was someone different. Someone who understood that survival isn't just about making it through the night. It's about making peace with who you are and what you've done wrong. Marcus and his family saved more than my life that day in the forest. They saved my soul. The relationship started slowly, carefully. After I was released from the hospital, I wanted to thank them properly for what they'd done. But when I showed up at their house with an envelope full of cash, the old Harold's solution to everything, Marcus politely but firmly refused it. "You don't owe us money," he said, standing in his doorway like a sentry. "Money is not why we helped you." "Then what can I do? How can I repay you?" He studied me for a long moment, this man who'd pulled me back from the edge of death and despair. "You want to repay us? Then live better, be better, don't waste the life we helped you save." So that's what I've tried to do. I started volunteering with their informal search and rescue group, the network of local men who knew these mountains like their own backyards, and who quietly helped when people got lost or injured in the wilderness. I couldn't hike anymore, not with my reconstructed ankle, but I could man the radio, coordinate with official emergency services, and use my accounting skills to help with their minimal paperwork. More importantly, I could share my story. At schools, community centers, anywhere people would listen, I talked about what happens when families fall apart, when pride and stubbornness replace love and understanding. I talked about the warning signs I'd missed, the conversations I'd avoided, the chances I'd squandered. Every harsh word is a seed, I'd tell the audiences, usually parents and teenagers sitting in uncomfortable folding chairs in church basements or school cafeterias. Plant enough of them, and eventually you'll harvest a crop of bitterness. Sometimes they listened, sometimes they didn't. But I kept talking, because maybe somewhere out there was another father making the same mistakes I'd made, and maybe my story could help him choose a different path. The hardest part was accepting that I might never have a relationship with Danny again. Even in prison, he refused to see me. My letters came back unopened. The few times I'd tried to visit, he'd sent word through the guards that he wanted nothing to do with me. "Some things can't be fixed," Marcus told me one evening as we sat on his porch, watching the sunset paint the mountains in shades of gold and purple. "Some damage goes too deep, but he's still my son," I said, the words feeling hollow even as I spoke them. "Being blood doesn't make someone family," Marcus replied, "and being family doesn't require blood." I understood what he meant as I watched Tommy finally master the knot he'd been working on. The boy looked up at his grandfather with pure joy, and Marcus smiled back with the kind of unconditional love that I'd never quite managed to give my own child. That's when I realized something important. I'd been so focused on the family I'd lost that I'd nearly missed the family I'd found. Marcus and Joseph had become the sons I'd never really had. Tommy and his sister Sarah had become the grandchildren I thought I'd never know. Their extended network of cousins, aunts, uncles, and family friends had embraced me as one of their own, not because I'd earned it or paid for it, but simply because I'd needed it, and they'd had it to give. Last month, Tommy asked me to help him with a school project about family trees. As we worked together at the kitchen table, drawing branches and filling in names, he matter-of-factly included me among his relatives. "Where should I put you, Grandfather Harold?" he asked, his pencil hovering over the paper. Grandfather Harold. Not Mr. Mitchell, not Harold, but Grandfather. The title I'd thought I'd lost forever when Danny was convicted. "Wherever you think I belong," I said, my voice thick with emotion I didn't try to hide. He drew a new branch, right next to Marcus and Joseph, and carefully wrote my name in his careful child's handwriting. "There," he said with satisfaction. "Now the tree is complete." Complete. Yes, that's exactly what it felt like. As I write this, sitting in the home where I found more love and acceptance than I ever experienced in my own house, I think about all of you who followed this story. You've been with me through the darkest moments of my life, through betrayal and abandonment, and the long climb back to something resembling peace. I don't know where you're reading this from, what country, what city, what circumstances brought you to my story, but I hope you'll take something from it. I hope you'll forgive the people who've hurt you, not because they deserve it, but because you deserve the peace that comes with letting go. I hope you'll be brave enough to accept love when it's offered, even if it comes from unexpected sources, and I hope you'll remember that family isn't always the people you're born to. Sometimes it's the people who choose you, who see you at your worst and decide to stay anyway, who pull you out of the wilderness and teach you how to live again. The old Harold died in those woods, but the man who lives here now, surrounded by love he never expected and never earned, is grateful every day for that death. Because sometimes, losing everything is the only way to find what really matters.